Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jude Blanchette, and I'm the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS. I want to thank everyone for joining us for the next hour or so as we drill down into the recently completed two sessions, which is, of course, the name given to the annual meeting of the National People's Congress, the NPC, and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which is known as the CPPCC. If you remember back just a few short years ago, these were relatively sleepy affairs outside of some foreign analysts, investors, companies who were waiting to see what China's annual growth target would be or what its defense spending priorities would be. But this has all changed over the past couple of years. Certainly those of us watching domestic politics began our ears perked up in 2018 when China announced this sweeping government overhaul at the NPC. And subsequently, as U.S. China relations have continued to deteriorate, the NPC and the CPPCC meetings are good moments to look to see what China and Beijing's domestic priorities are, but also what their external messaging and evaluation of the global environment is. Interest in this year's meeting was already mounting after a several-month delay as a result of the COVID-19 crisis hitting China, an outbreak in and around Wuhan late last year. But certainly the continued and extraordinary deteriorations in bilateral relations with the United States meant there were extra eyeballs watching it this year. And certainly the outcome of this is one that we'll be wrestling with for some time now. Joining me to dive into the implications and outcomes of the NPC and the CPCCC are my two colleagues, Bonnie Glaser, who's a senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project at CSIS, and Scott Kennedy, who's a senior advisor and the trustee chair in Chinese business and economics, also at CSIS. We've got 58 minutes left, so what we'll do is we'll go down the line, starting with Scott, to unpack some of the individual policies or areas that we think are of note here. Scott is going to look at economic policy. I'm going to look at some of the other domestic policy that came out of this, in particular the civil code. Then I'll turn it over to Bonnie, who will be looking at what we can understand out of this year's defense budget, as well as some of the messaging on Taiwan. We'll then, of course, have to talk about Hong Kong, which we'll briefly do, and then we'll open this up for Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, there's a dedicated link on the CSIS website. Go to csis.org/events. Find the listing for this event happening now, and if you click it, you'll see that there's a secure link for you to ask a question. And you can do that at any time now up through the end of the program, and those will be directed to us, and we will take those in turn. With that, for the remaining 57 minutes, I'm looking forward to the discussion. So I'm going to first turn it over to my colleague, Scott Kennedy. Scott, over to you.
Jude, thanks so much. And good morning, everybody. Welcome to the month of June. Welcome to this event where we're going to break down the National People's Congress, which concluded last week. I would say that looking at the issue of the economy and where it fit in the NPC, I would not give it the adjective that it was sleepy. In fact, a lot happened, a lot extremely important. And as Jude said, we're going to be wrestling with these implications for a long time, and certainly the Chinese leadership will as well. If I was going to use one word to describe what happened on the economy at the NPC, I would use the word pragmatic. In every way in which they were not pragmatic on Hong Kong, which we'll talk about later, the Chinese were pragmatic in the way in which they discussed and handled the economy during the NPC. And let me just mention 3 points here. First, the Chinese, as everybody should know by now, scrapped their growth target for the year. We've put up a slide that shows you what the Chinese have done in terms of setting growth targets and actual performance. Actually, the Chinese for the last 30 years, going back even before this chart, have had a growth target. But they abandoned it, and that's an amazing, in some ways, revolutionary step for China's economic governance, because the growth target is the North Star of China's political economy. It sets a clear target for policymakers, for those that work in ministries, those that work in local governments, and it's a signal to businesses, domestic and foreign, what China's economic priorities are for the year, wrapped up in that single number and conveyed at each NPC, usually each March. It's very much like the U.S. Fed's signaling around interest rates. It really orients everyone. And the removal of that target is going to be disorienting for everybody, including in the government, in the party, and outsiders as well. But nevertheless, they decided to abandon that target because, well, if they stuck to it, they would have had to set a target around 1.5%, which is way, way lower than any other target that they've had before. And of course, they wouldn't want to do that. In addition, they didn't want to signal that they only cared about growth and they didn't care about people. Given that China's lost somewhere between 60 million and 100 million jobs as a result of the pandemic. That's a huge number. About half of those are migrant labor who had nothing to do following the outbreak of the pandemic, but it's actually affected every sector of the economy, both state-owned enterprises and small and medium-sized private companies as well. And so they abandoned that target to show that they care for these people. And they came forth with a variety of policies in March and April, reaffirmed at the NPC, to provide reassurance and support for Chinese workers and those who've lost their jobs. I think the most important target at the NPC was setting the goal of reducing unemployment to about 5.5%. And employment jumped officially to about 6%. It's probably somewhere closer to 15% in reality, but they're going to try and reduce it. They've also said that they are going to try and keep companies afloat, reduce the number of bankruptcies, and increase real income for everybody, not just raise growth. And I think this is a good step. It would be nice if they continue with it, but they may not. They may, once you get to the end of this year, they may turn back on the growth target because it's been so important. But this is a chance for them to abandon it and focus on other elements and have a more diverse set of goals each year, which makes sense, I think, for an economy that is really through its fast growth phase and needs to really focus on not just the quality of growth, but also providing a stronger social safety net and addressing a whole variety of other challenges. Other ways in which, there are two other ways in which they were pragmatic in talking about the economy at the NPC. The second one is just a series of efforts to show their competence about basic issues. The first is about domestic issues, the civil code, which I'll leave to Jude to go into, but really a pretty significant step to unify a whole series of different laws to make them consistent with each other about the basic rights and responsibilities and how people interact with each other across property and many other areas. In addition, they set reasonable budget deficit, that max fiscal deficit of 3.6% of GDP this year. That's much larger than they've had in the past. Usually it's gone no higher than 3% of GDP, but that's still reasonable given what China has been going through. They have a moderately loose monetary policy. Again, they have thrown more at this problem than they had in the past, but they have not thrown everything. They still have some things in reserve. And China's spending from the government, whether it's fiscal or monetary, isn't going to come anywhere close to what the U.S. is doing. The U.S. has basically took off all limits on spending, zero concern about deficits and debt right now in the U.S. The Chinese are still trying to balance that. In addition, the Chinese have tried to reassure foreign investors that China is still a good place to do business, even with U.S. China tensions. And their treatment at the local level by local officials has improved. And the Chinese have even hinted that they might be interested in joining the CPTPP, which would require more economic reforms and liberalization. Finally, the Chinese on technology did also look somewhat pragmatic. They did not say that China wants to decouple from the rest of the world and dominate every sector with no involvement from everybody else. They did say they want to move up the value chains. And they also said that they wanted to use short-term infrastructure investment to focus on high tech like 5G and autonomous vehicles. They tried to be reassuring that for domestic and foreign companies, their approach towards technology would not try to overdo things. So all of that, to me, adds up to an effort to at least try to be pragmatic. Nevertheless, they can only go so far. The Chinese started again to use the word reform. They issued some documents in advance of the NPC promoting the idea of structural reforms, talked about it a lot ad nauseum at the NPC. But there are obviously real constraints on how far they're going to move, because your and my definition of what reform is not the Chinese official definition. Your and my reform definition is marketization domestically, liberalization internationally. Chinese definition under Xi Jinping is let's make the state run more effectively. And we will look at markets. In some places, we may advance markets. In some places, we may limit them, depending on what works for us, which means still a healthy, permanent dose of Communist Party and government intervention in this economy long term. And so China has still signaled that they are never going to align their economy with the way our economy or other market economies operate. So yes, more pragmatic, but still significant boundaries. A lot of the competence that we see from China actually reminds me of another country that was growing quite quickly, was globalized, and that's Germany in the late 19th century. China today looks a lot like Bismarckian Germany. Of course, that turned out well in economic terms for Germany, but it didn't turn out well for the rest of Europe or the world. And you can't see all of that by looking at German economic policy, but you can look at, if you look at German politics and foreign policy, and that's why I'm going to turn things over to Jude and Bonnie. So look forward to the discussion.
Well, thanks, Scott. I'm going to talk about, as Scott mentioned, the civil code here in a minute, but I wanted to make just one general remark on, I think, a shift that's been occurring in China over the past 6 to 9 months for sure, but has been picking up pace over the past 3 months. And I think will frame not only what China's domestic policy agenda is moving forward, and I won't get into Bonnie's territory here, but I think what will frame in general their view of the external environment and their foreign policy going forward. And I want to focus on one line from Xi Jinping's speech to members of the CPPCC. And I'm just going to read it at a few sentences here, so bear with me. But he said, this year we will face unfavorable conditions such as deeply declining global economic growth, greatly shrunk international trade and investment, a volatile international financial market, restricted international interaction, economic globalization hitting headwind, protectionism and unilateralism prevailing in some countries, and increased geopolitical risks. And he ended this by saying, we must seek development in a much more unstable and uncertain world. I think that's building on certainly how Xi Jinping has been looking at risk domestically in China and internationally. But I think we're now really seeing a paradigm shift in how Beijing is viewing its development path moving forward. And so building on what Scott just said on reform as having a slightly different definition than the normative one we use in the United States and in the West, I think the Chinese state is undergoing some pretty important transformations right now to be able to buttress itself and fortify itself to deal with this much more complex and, as Xi Jinping said, unstable and uncertain world. And I think this is going to have some very profound knock-on effects for whether that's companies operating in China or for foreign powers who are now having to rub up against China increasingly. This is going to be a much more prickly, aggressive China that is no longer looking to, I think, play second fiddle to the United States, but now sees its own relative power as having increased to such an extent that it can start throwing its elbows around. But importantly, I think, and I'll talk about this in my comments on Hong Kong, views the West and the United States in particular in a crisis of sorts, which I think is hard to argue with at this very moment. But nonetheless, that message came through the MPC and the CPCCC for me, which is Beijing is just viewing the world as a very, very different place, and not a continuation of its increasingly risk-based approach starting in, let's say, 2008. But I think this is a qualitatively and a quantitatively different one. Shifting gears totally, I now want to focus on something which, if it wasn't for all the other news going on, would have made headlines, which is, as with the 2018 government reforms in China that were lost to the headlines of the trade war, again, we had a pretty important legal shift in China with the approval of its first civil code, which is this massive gargantuan codification of private laws in more than 1,200 individual articles that cover the whole swath of property, marriage, torts, contracts. This is, despite the focus on, and rightfully so, on issues like Hong Kong and the growth target, it will be this civil code that will touch on the daily lives of most of China's 1.4 billion citizens. And that's why I think the drafts on this civil code attracted such public attention. When they put out the draft for public comments, it received nearly 1 million of these. Most of them dealing with issues of property and marriage, but that shows you where most of the workaday concerns are for Chinese citizens, much like any other country. If we had something equivalent here in the United States, this would certainly be headline making, but I think there's a slight disconnect between domestic policy in China and where foreign eyeballs are, and we often lose track of these things. This was not the first time China has made an attempt to get a civil code. In fact, this is the 5th attempt since the founding of the PRC in 1949. They made an attempt in 1956 and again in 1962. Especially 1956, that was the year of the anti-rightist campaign and the 100 Flowers campaign. The effort was felled by domestic politics. In 1979, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun, spearheaded a campaign for comprehensive civil code reform as a part of this effort to modernize China's governance and legal system, to position it and to position the Chinese state to be able to better deliver on the needs and necessities of Chinese citizens. That fell, and it fell again in the 2000s for similar reasons, which is, I think Beijing recognized that the speed of change occurring then in China, certainly in 1979, was such that very soon anything they codified would be outpaced by societal, technological, political changes, and so they put it aside. The campaign started again in 2014 as a part of Xi Jinping's overall theory of governance modernization. I mean, we focus a lot on the Communist Party growth under Xi Jinping, and that's extraordinarily important. But I think sitting under that or next to that is this idea of state modernization and governance modernization and legal modernization. And so these efforts have been building slowly in tandem, or at least subservient to the growth of the party. But nonetheless, this has been an important dynamic to be watching in China, is in many ways the professionalization and maturation of its legal system, even within the constraints of judges are still picked by the Communist Party. And certainly in politically sensitive cases, it's not the judge who's making the call, it's the CCP. But the vast majority of legal proceedings and legal cases in China are fairly banal in the sense that they're about just workaday concerns of, a can of paint falls from the 3rd story and hits a passerby in the head. How do you adjudicate that? And that's what's in that's what's in this new civil code. So I think it's important to remember that we essentially have 2 tracks occurring right now in China's legal judicial system. One is the one that I think most of us external observers are watching, which is this issue of the growth of the Communist Party and movement away from what I would call the Deng Xiaoping project of independence and separation of legal, judicial, political institutions from the Communist Party. Xi Jinping has been reversing those and really bringing the party back in and layering the party over everything. Yet at the same time, beneath that heuristic, we're seeing some of these important efforts to professionalize and modernize. And for an average citizen, those probably mean more than the politicization of the judges, which really rear their heads in much more sensitive national security or political security cases. And so this is an important space, I think, to be watching as we move forward. The Communist Party is very comfortable with contradictions. As good Marxists, it's something we don't deal with as well here in the United States, but is understanding how does a system, maybe to build on Scott's point, how do subsystems progress pragmatically and in many ways become increasingly institutionalized at a local level within an overall environmental shift of more and more Communist Party, which again is going to have some important knock-on effects for us, but also those are going to lean against some of the progress they're making in some of these smaller areas. So anyway, I'll just for time's sake, I'm going to pause there, but I just wanted to flag the civil code because it was lost amidst the, again, rightfully so, all of the press on Hong Kong. But nonetheless, for those who are looking to see where China's overall governance, legal institutions, and system are progressing and where they're progressing, the civil code is going to be important, although I think no one's going to read the darn thing because it's 1,200 articles long, but nonetheless is worth familiarizing ourselves with. So with that, I'm going to stop and I will turn it over to Bonnie.
Well, thanks, Jude. And following on the great presentations by my colleagues, I'm going to talk a little bit just about defense spending and Taiwan. So if you could put up the slide, we have got a couple of slides to show you. Well, the first one shows us just that China's increase in defense spending, which of course is announced every year at the National People's Congress. And this year it is going to increase by 6.6%. It's a little bit less than last year. 2019 increase was 7.5%. But of course, you can see on that graph that China's defense spending in terms of the percentage increase has been going down. It has not risen by double digits since 2014. Military spending is set to rise against, of course, a context of a slowdown in the economy. And as Scott said, there was no target set for economic growth, but the IMF has set an estimate, at least, that China's economy is going to grow by about 1.2% this year. So that's pretty significant. I think that the defense spending figure continues to be very substantial. And at the same time, central government expenditure is projected to decline by 0.2%. So I think this demonstrates that Xi Jinping is very committed to modernizing the military. We know that, of course, because at the 19th Party Congress in 2017, Xi Jinping had set targets for the military in 2035 and in 2049. So in the next 15 years, the PLA should become a completely modernized, professionalized military. And then looking out, of course, to the middle of the century, the PLA should become a first-tier military. So essentially on a par in various ways, not explicit, of course, with the United States. So move to the next slide. Here, I just want to mention that foreign estimates of Chinese military spending are, of course, different. What we've been talking about so far is the official estimate. And in 2019, the Chinese government had reported an official defense budget of just under 178 billion. And usually I look to CIPRI, the Stockholm International Research, Peace Research Institute, to compare what the spending would be. And their estimates last year was 261 billion. That's about 50% higher than the official figure. We don't have the CIPRI estimate yet for 2020, but most people think that China's spending on defense is higher than the official figure. Let's move just now to the last slide, which shows that the spending on the military as a percentage of the national government budget has remained fairly steady for really the last 8 years. It's about 5%. It's actually, the uptick is very slight. It's going from 5.06 to 5.12%. So it's basically the same. And I think that's fairly significant, that the percentage of spending on overall on in the budget on the military has been about the same. The last word I'll just say on defense spending is that the Chinese don't tell us how much they're spending on each of the services. We don't know. Of course, we can guess they're spending more in the Navy and the Air Force than they are in the Army, but we don't know the really granular breakdown of defense spending. And sometimes the white paper gives a little bit of additional insights into certain areas where the defense expenditures are. But we don't have the kind of information that the United States and some other countries provide. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Taiwan. The National People's Congress opened with Premier Li Keqiang in his oral presentation of the government work report, not using the modifier peaceful before reunification. China's goal, of course, is sometimes it's the word unification is used when the goal that is being talked about is just long-term, we want to achieve reunification. When the Chinese usually talk about strategy or policy, they usually use this modifier peaceful. And importantly, Li Keqiang didn't use it, and most of the NPC work reports in the past have used peaceful when they talked about unification. And this triggered concern about a possible change in Chinese policy and even an impending decision to use force. I disagree with that. I'll talk about that a little bit. But I also want to say that the Chinese decided to use this occasion of the NPC and the CPPCC to mark the 15th anniversary of the passage of the anti-secession law. So that also, I think, increased some worries. But in my view, by the end of these two sessions, it was clear to me that Chinese policy toward Taiwan has not changed in any fundamental way. Of course, there's more saber rattling. There's harsher language being used. There are warnings being issued, which I believe are in part aimed at the United States, not just at Taiwan. And we can expect tougher tactics, more pressure on Taiwan, militarily, diplomatically, even economically. But a shift in the policy of opposing Taiwan independence while pursuing peaceful development across the strait, that has not come about. And I want to note that answering a question about Taiwan at the closing NPC press conference, Premier Li Keqiang did mention peaceful unification and also the 1992 consensus. So even though it wasn't in the government work report, he did use that terminology. Then, of course, the NPC head, Li Jianshu, also reaffirmed peaceful unification in his work report. And he also referred to one country, two systems, which have been applied to Hong Kong, but the Chinese, for, of course, many years, have talked about the application of some form of one country, two systems to Taiwan. Indeed, it was originally developed for Taiwan. And the 1992 consensus was mentioned by Li Jianshu as well. And just to quote one thing that he said, we are willing to create vast space for peaceful reunification, but we will definitely not leave any room for separatist activities aimed at Taiwan independence in any form. Of course, he said non-peaceful means were an option, but he also said it's a last resort. And I think that this is consistent with past Chinese policy. Finally, he said, and this is, I think, an important sentence that signals to us that the Chinese have not abandoned peaceful reunification. He said, as long as there's the slightest chance of a peaceful resolution, we will put in 100 times the effort. So in my view, we have not seen a change. The anti-secession law was discussed in an interesting way. It is not being portrayed as a justification to use force against Taiwan, but rather as an example of the kind of law that is needed to protect China's sovereignty against foreign interference in China's internal affairs. And this, of course, is a concern we're also seeing in Hong Kong. So finally, I would say my conclusion is that despite growing concerns in Beijing about Tsai Ing-wen's policies in her second term, about a weak KMT, about unfavorable public opinion in Taiwan toward China, unification, growing sense of Taiwan identity, certainly concern about U.S. policies toward Taiwan. Despite all of these factors, Beijing has not concluded that its policy has failed and should be abandoned. Though I don't rule out that there will be a rethink, perhaps ongoing adjustments, and maybe sometime in the future we will see a shift in policy. But this year's two meetings did not signal that. And I'll turn the floor back over to Jude so we can talk about Hong Kong.
Great. We'll save the easiest issue for last. So we've already got a pretty good queue of questions here. So what I think we'll do is, just to make sure that we get to Hong Kong, the three of us will just offer some pretty brief comments here, and then we'll dive into Q&A. A lot of these are about about Hong Kong. I just wanted to make a broader point about less about Hong Kong and more about Beijing's appetite for risk, which appears to be increasing over the past several months. Certainly on the actual specifics of the legality and the implications of the proposed national security law, we're going to be talking about this for a while, and I'm sure Bonnie and Scott have thoughts on this, as well as what the U.S. is likely to do or not to do next. But the observation I wanted to offer, or thought I wanted to offer, is actually in regards to what appears to be this general shift in Beijing that I referenced earlier in my remarks about an increased aggressiveness. Something we've seen a wave of this in and around 2008 with the global financial crisis. But I think there are two things occurring right now which are putting Beijing in a position where its risk tolerance is increasing. One is I think it feels increasingly empowered, and then the second is I think it feels exasperated. Empowered because the Beijing is making a calculation or an observation that the international environment is, or the balance of power is tipping in its favor. This is something Beijing is quite adept to as good historical materialists, which is always looking at the balance of power and making objective scientific observations about where it stands in that international environment. And crucially, I think Beijing is quite adept at identifying strategic opportunities or windows of strategic opportunity. Of course, we're in a big window, which occurred, depends on when you want to date it, but from the early 2000s, where Beijing assessed that the United States, both there's a positive opportunity of engagement with the United States just after WTO, but then looking at US involvement in the Middle East and then the global financial crisis, Beijing thought this is a time for it to push forward. Within that general window, I think, especially the Xi administration often sees many strategic opportunities, and it sees one right now. Rewind 2 or 3 months ago, and we thought Xi Jinping was on the ropes. You know, there was rising frustration domestically about the mishandling and bungling of the coronavirus. And so there was a lot of think pieces about, is this the end for Xi Jinping? What we couldn't have, or what we should have, but didn't understand, is that this governance crisis or public health crisis was going to hit the United States even worse. And this is, I think, emboldened the Xi administration to push forward on a number of different areas. So there's a word Xi Jinping talks about a lot, which is initiative. And I see that as one of the hallmarks of the Xi administration is pushing forward when it sees these opportunities arising. And again, the speech I referenced earlier, one of his other lines from this is, we need to work hard to nurture new opportunities during crisis. So a general sense of empowered and strength, I think, is a key feature of some of these moves we're seeing Beijing make around the world. But the second part is exasperated. And I don't mean this as my own personal judgment or to defend it, just to say, when you look at the writings and the speeches of Beijing, I think they feel generally quite frustrated, both with the amount of external pressure they're getting, a kind of what me approach to this, a victim mentality, but also in the specific case of Hong Kong, they don't want this to lose its economic and political status from the United States. A lot of people say, you know, it'll just become another Chinese city. Beijing doesn't want it to become just another Chinese city. There are really important material advantages of Hong Kong being both under de jure control, while at the same time existing in an international environment that Beijing can take advantage of. But nonetheless, I think they've made a calculation that the status quo in Hong Kong was untenable and that they had to move forward aggressively on this. But, and this is my final point, they moved aggressively in a way that also was within the trappings of apparent legality, right? So They're doing this very formalistically, quite publicly, I think because they recognize, although they feel they need to strike hard, they don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. If they can balance that or thread that needle, I think is very difficult to say, and is likely not going to, they're not going to be able to achieve that. But nonetheless, I think we again need to be adjusting to a Beijing that is increasingly empowered, or at least feels empowered, and also exasperated with the general international environment and willing to push back against it. And that's going to lead to a proliferation of flashpoints for the U.S. to deal with. So I'll stop there. Maybe just because she's up on my screen, I'll go to Bonnie next for some thoughts, and then to Scott.
Great, Jude. Good, really excellent points. I think that the Chinese see a lot of risks in the international environment as well as opportunities. Balancing those and making sure that they successfully seize those opportunities is really what I think the Chinese are doing. Hong Kong was a risk. The elections coming up in September, the possibility that the Democrats could even win a majority was, I think, the Chinese are thinking about the worst case. When the protests took place in 2019, the Chinese just had no mechanism whatsoever to shape events in Hong Kong. And people were in the streets desecrating the PRC flag. And I think this was just untenable. The Chinese did not have any tolerance level for this happening again. So they seized upon what they legally have the right to do, and that is to pass a national security law. The question, of course, remains whether or not it is also going to be passed by the LegCo in Hong Kong. But I think the point that I would like to make is that we don't know how China is going to actually implement this law. And that is where the United States hopes by coming out very, very tough and threatening some measures, including changing Hong Kong's special status, although what the president said last Friday, to me, he fudged it. It was not really clear what concrete steps the U.S. is going to take, but the State Department did not certify that Hong Kong is fully autonomous. And so that will set in motion a consultation between the executive branch and Congress. And then there are obviously many options that are under consideration. And so going forward, the US is trying to influence Chinese decision-making, probably not deterring China from passing this law, which is likely to happen in the next few months. But the issue of implementation, I think, is still a question mark. Finally, I would say that I think that China expects that the international community will not do very much because Hong Kong, of course, is part of China. The handover took place in '97. This is not the same as Taiwan. And even there, the international community is reluctant to challenge China. And so beyond rhetorical statements, I think Beijing is confident that very little will be done to really harm Chinese interests going forward. And we'll have to see in that regard if they are correct. In my view, the Trump administration is trying to stare down Beijing, and Beijing is trying to stare down the United States. Hopefully, all this will not take place at the expense of Hong Kong. Turn the floor over to you, Scott, for your remarks.
Thanks, Bonnie. Jude, both very helpful. Let me just add a couple things about how I see what's going on in Hong Kong. The first, just to emphasize what's economically at stake in Hong Kong for the United States. So $67 billion in trade between the United States and Hong Kong, goods and services each year, 85,000 American residents working in 1,300 American companies, and about 300 of those being American financial institutions. Hong Kong is the world's third largest financial market, and of course, it is the place to go to do trading in renminbi and the yuan. And if you want to invest in Chinese companies that not and you have difficulty or concerns about investing directly in them through Shenzhen or Shanghai, Hong Kong is a place to go because it has good rule of law. And lastly, it's a safe harbor for signing contracts, for defending them in court. And so it's very important for Americans. So a lot is at stake for what's going on right now. Second, I would agree with Jude that China, that Beijing is more aggressive. They feel frustrated. But I would also emphasize a real ideological change under Xi Jinping. And I'm speaking right next to the man, Jude, who wrote the book on Chinese ideological transitions, but just want to re-emphasize that and that Xi Jinping's view of the role of the party, the state-society relations, China's place in the world is different from his predecessors. Not 180 degrees, but real qualitative differences. China was on a path to integrate its economy and marketize before Xi Jinping. They are not on that path now. China had a policy of being a multi-ethnic state where they wouldn't give equal status to all 56 ethnicities, but they try and protect those minorities to some degree. They are not doing that. And they agreed that Hong Kong ought to have a significant amount of autonomy. It ought to have some differences in the actual laws and space for society than the rest of China. And the procedures by which any changes would be made there'd be more space for Hong Kongers to do that themselves and to interpret those changes by the courts. But all of those things have changed under Xi Jinping. Now, it may be just because China is more powerful and it's frustrated because over time its strategy is not working. I really think it has fundamentally to do with Xi Jinping's different view, the evolution of Chinese official ideology, which means for me, the distinction, just to highlight, is that I don't think that this is necessarily permanent forever just because as long as China is more powerful. I think it depends on the type of leaders that you have at the top in China. And so Xi Jinping may be in power for a very long time, but nevertheless, I don't think that there's a unified view within China about this approach to all those issues I just listed. Lastly, just to emphasize, I think because of Xi Jinping's approach, his control over the system, the ultimate outcome, if he stays in power and moves ahead, is pretty clear. Hong Kong's autonomy is going to shrivel and die, and it won't be the same Hong Kong. That said, the pace at which this change occurs, the sequence, the form, whether it's iron-fisted or more nuanced, all of that is still up in the air. And so American policy, British policy, the rest of the world still can affect the way in which Hong Kong's future is shaped, even if under Xi Jinping, the high degree of autonomy is eventually going to disappear.
Great. Well, thank you. Great thoughts, Scott and Bonnie. So we've got a really great list of questions here. What I think I'll do is, because many of them overlap, I'm just going to group a couple of these together. I'm going to pose one first to Bonnie, but Scott, to give you a heads up, there's a couple questions here about events over the past couple days on the phase one trade deal, including this Bloomberg report that China has halted or directed its SOEs to halt soy and pork purchases. I know this may be adjacent to the NPC, but because half the questions are clearly from financiers in New York City who won't identify themselves, they want to know what's going to happen with the trade deal. I'll just pose that to you. And then Bonnie, this is one I know we've been talking about, you've been thinking about, which is going back to this issue of China's, whether you want to call it Xi-led aggressiveness or more structural-led aggressiveness. What's the cost of this to Beijing in terms of its international standing? We've been talking about some of the more positive developments for Beijing and being able to throw its weight around. But I want to get your thoughts. Some folks are just asking sort of, what's the cost of this? Is this wolf warrior diplomacy? Is this aggressiveness impacting some of China's other long-term interests? Is it harming its soft power? What's your take on the sort of the costs, real or metaphorical, to wolf warrior style behavior?
I think that that's a great question, and one that I am thinking about, and we will have to watch closely going forward. I believe that China is going to pay a significant cost and probably underestimates the cost that it is paying. It was interesting that there was an article, I think about 1 month ago, that referenced a report by the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations that was allegedly leaked, that said that China assesses, or the kicker assesses, that the international environment is not favorable, or the attitudes really towards, not the environment, but the attitudes, global attitudes towards China are at the lowest levels since June of 1989. And I really think that's probably right. China's wolf warrior diplomacy, which we really have seen an uptick during the pandemic, but started earlier, is very much welcomed at home in China, but has led, I think, to creating some antibodies abroad. And to cite one instance, there was a statement, I think, by one Chinese official, I believe it was on Twitter, that said that the French have been not protecting their citizens, and they were allowing people to die in nursing homes. So there are really many examples of the Chinese Foreign Ministry official, the deputy spokesman, Zhao Lijian, really lashing out. In some cases, responding to things that U.S. officials are saying, like Secretary Pompeo. But China's paying costs in other ways. And another example that I will mention is that in many cases where China's providing medical supplies and equipment or trying to assist people around the world, it has been asking for statements of gratitude, including from the state legislature of Wisconsin, where I read the text of a draft resolution that was sent to someone in the legislature that they asked to have passed. That didn't succeed. But these kinds of efforts, I think, are really raising some prickly responses from countries around the world. But I would close by saying that a lot of countries in the world still want things from China. Belt and Road countries, for example, they have debt. They would like their loans to be, the repayments extended, for example, or they may want to get more money in the future, or they fear punishment from China. And so the jury is still out in terms of the long-term cost that China is going to face as a result of some of these practices.
Okay, Scott, over to you. Is phase one dead, and are these actions over the past few days by Beijing in response to Trump's press conference on Friday, or more aggressive rhetoric from the U.S.?
I think phase one was always on weak legs, and now we're seeing that. I think probably what the news reports about China deciding to buy less of pork, corn, cotton, soybeans could be a reflection of simply responding to the moves on Hong Kong the president announced on Friday, although he announced an attitude, but U.S. took no specific measures on Hong Kong on Friday. However, it could be about that and the steps a couple weeks ago the U.S. took on Huawei, a series of things, and the overall rhetorical framing of the relationship that the Trump administration is taking. But I don't think that the Chinese want to just simply openly walk from the deal. They can, if they wanted to, send a note and give 60 days written notice. But they probably want to put the onus on the United States. And when the two sides met in early May to discuss the deal, the U.S. said they were fine with Chinese compliance, and the Chinese said they still wanted to stay in the deal. Of course, that could change. If Trump walks fully from the deal, that is in some ways helps him keep up his tough guy bona fides. On the other hand, it definitely means that it's going to be harder for American farmers and others in the Midwest who are counting on the growth of these exports to help them in the middle of the deepest recession the U.S. has faced in a very, very long time. And now we're seeing, domestic civil unrest as well. So this would be a third punch to the gut for certain Americans.
Great. Bonnie, we've got a Taiwan question here, which it's just building on some of the remarks you made earlier, but it's connecting. Let's imagine a weak response to the Hong Kong issue by the international community, and maybe again, it's too early to tell exactly what the U.S. response will be on Hong Kong, but let's just imagine it doesn't go much further than last Friday's press conference. Does this embolden the PRC vis-a-vis Taiwan and taking more aggressive action? I guess that's just another way of asking it. What is driving Beijing's view on Taiwan? Is it how it will balance, or how it's assessing what the international reaction will be, or is it that in tandem with other developments or dynamics?
Well, as I wrote in an article co-authored with my colleague Matthew Funioli several weeks ago, and you can find the article in Foreign Policy, I don't think that China has given up on Taiwan and its policy, and I don't think it's given up on unification. I don't think it is poised to attack Taiwan in the near term, but it is, however, trying to lay down markers and warn the United States to not go too far, and remind the United States that it has a commitment to a one China policy. I think that, yes, Beijing will be emboldened if there is a weak response to Hong Kong, but we've already seen China take many, many steps to ratchet up pressure on Taiwan in the first few months of this year, since the re-election of President Tsai Ing-wen in January. And we've seen this in the military realm. There were 2 consecutive days in February where the Chinese sent large numbers of aircraft across the center line. And in one instance, a Chinese fighter jet locked on to a Taiwanese fighter jet, which is very dangerous. And I think that there has not been sufficient attention to the kind of risk-taking that China is engaging in, particularly in the military realm. But of course, we've also seen this in the diplomatic area, where China has seized more than half a dozen of Taiwan's diplomatic allies since President Tsai was elected the first time. We're going to see more of this. Yes, China could be emboldened to do more, but I don't think that China would conclude that if it attacked Taiwan militarily, that the international community would do nothing. And so I think that we have to draw a distinction between what it's doing in terms of pressure that it will continue doing, and whether or not, or under what circumstances, it would feel confident enough that it could get away with actually using force against Taiwan. And that's why I don't see that in the immediate future. And I think that China's interests are in preventing Taiwan from going independent, de jure independent. And I think that they are relatively confident at this point that Taiwan does not have a path to independence.
Great, thank you, Bonnie. Scott, there's a couple questions here on a similar vein, excuse me, about what tools Beijing may or may not use in terms of economic normalization. I think kind of lumping these questions together, it's essentially saying, if things continue to get bad, do they revert to a sort of global financial crisis, post-global financial crisis style response of credit, fixed asset investment spending, bridges to nowhere? Or is there a new style of economic recovery? Is there a new economic recovery toolkit that Beijing is going to use here, even if things get worse?
Sure. I think they've are entirely aware that post-global financial crisis, when they announced the 4 trillion renminbi stimulus package, that a lot of it was just wasted, went down a rat hole, never to help anybody but make the numbers look better, and generated a lot of the challenges that they've been facing over the last 10 years. It's really been a weight holding them down from having a more productive economy more efficient. And so I think they want to be as careful as possible. The last 3 years, domestic financial policy has been all about reducing risk to the extent that they can. And it also meant less Chinese outward investment. Belt and road related investment in real terms is down quite a bit. So I don't think that they want to just simply open the faucets if they don't have to. So we're going to see a lot, but I think they're trying to be targeted, even if the numbers end up being as large as in the past, trying to focus on things which they think would be really productive, advanced technologies, more on healthcare and the social safety net is where I think that those funds will go, and a lot more will be centrally directed and monitored in order for them to avoid this. So I think the numbers could end up being larger than they look like they are now, but I think they're going to try and make it so that as much of this as possible isn't just simply thrown at the problem. Of course, we'll all have to see and make decisions about that. I would say, they are trying. I think they would like to model themselves in terms of spending more like Germany than the United States at this point.
Great, thank you. So we've just got a few minutes left, so I'm going to take a last question here together, which is on November and how Beijing is assessing it. There's this mugs game of sort of who does Beijing want to win, and usually the answer to that is given by someone who works in a respective campaign. So I'll just ask the two of you, less who do they want to win, because the answer is we don't know, but maybe it just ask you to think through how Beijing may or may not assess, or how it may or may not change its playbook, depending on if it's a Biden victory or if it's Trump 2.0. What will be different? What will remain the same? Maybe Bonnie, I'll start with you.
Well, first, I would say that I think Beijing's top priority is, to the extent possible, to remain out of the crosshairs over the next 6 months. As the campaign continues, there will be China bashing by both the presumptive nominee, Vice President Biden, and of course, President Trump. And we saw this in spades last Friday, and in the report that was issued by the White House a few weeks ago outlining the strategy toward China. So I think that China is quite concerned about what's going to happen over the next 6 months, and the downward spiral in the U.S. China relationship and how bad it could get. I think that I've heard different things from people in China about which candidate they think will be worse for China. I think most people expect that there's going to continue to be a tough U.S. policy. There may be more continuity, in fact, than change if Biden is president. It was interesting, though, that the GT editor, Global Times editor, Hui Xijin, actually tweeted, I think about a week ago, that Trump would be better for China if he is reelected. And he is certainly representative of a certain group of people within China. So those people who want more predictability in the U.S.-China relationship, I think, want Vice President Biden to be president. If those who think that that China would be able to resume at least some kind of cooperation with the United States, maybe on climate change, pandemics, things like that. But there are other people who are looking more long-term and saying Trump creates opportunities for China to increase its participation and role of leader in the international community. Of course, best example is that the United States just withdrew from the World Health Organization, and now we've ceded leadership to China. And of course, the United States has done that elsewhere. So the policy towards international organizations, as well as weakening alliances, is beneficial to China. And that plays to China's longer term ambitions. So I think it really depends on who you talk to in China. There's pros and cons of each leader. But ultimately, China will deal with whatever hand it is dealt. It always has, and it will adjust.
Great. Scott, we just got a minute left. Any thoughts on this?
I think Bonnie covered the ground in terms of what are the alternatives that the Chinese see, and I would say it's a mixed picture. I think it comes down fundamentally to a question of whether they can see whether or not Trump Biden or anybody in the U.S. will adopt a policy of peaceful coexistence with China. Right now, it looks like the U.S. sees China as an existential threat, and that there's no potential floor in the relationship other than a deeply weakened China, or one where the Communist Party is not in rule. And of course, the United States has a similar parallel kinds of concerns about a Xi Jinping-led China. I think until any U.S. leader clarifies what its bottom lines are, what type of relationship is necessary in order to have a stable relationship and peacefully coexist, both Republicans and Democrats, folks across the political spectrum in the United States, are going to be tough on China in one way or another. And so at the end of the day, part of this is about what happens after the election isn't just about whether it's Trump 2 or a Biden first administration. Is going to be, how do the Chinese respond? And so far, whether it was under Obama or Trump, they have not provided enough reassurance for the United States and the rest of the world. And so until China is willing to adapt, it's going to be much harder for the U.S., regardless of who's in power, to find a stable relationship with China.
Great. Well, thank you. On that optimistic note, I want to thank all of you for joining us, and thanks, of course, to Scott and Bonnie. Apologies, we went a minute over, but it was a great last minute. So thanks to Scott for those final remarks. We'll be all the issues that we discussed here today, I think, are going to be ones that we'll all be returning to certainly over the next couple months. There's a lot at stake here, and the picture is evolving rapidly. So I hope you continue to follow us at CSIS, and hope everyone has a great day and a great week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.